I never expected to be threatened with arrest over a mailbox. Yet there it was, an obnoxiously bright orange notice taped to the post in front of my house, fluttering slightly in the evening breeze. My stomach clenched the second I saw it. It looked like a warning sign, the kind you'd see before stepping onto dangerous territory. And in a way, it was. I tore the paper from the post, my fingers gripping the edges so tightly the cheap ink smudged. Violation. Unapproved mailbox design. Failure to comply within 48 hours will result in fines and legal action. I blinked at the words, rereading them just to make sure I hadn't imagined them. I hadn't. A scoff escaped me, sharp and bitter. Was this a joke? No, of course not. This was Westwood Heights, a neighborhood that pretended to be upscale while suffocating its residents with rules so ridiculous they felt designed to drive people insane. The Homeowners Association was at the center of it all. A self-appointed dictatorship that policed every little thing. The length of your grass, the shade of your front door, the number of decorative plants you could have on your porch, there was nothing they wouldn't sink their claws into. But this was something else entirely. A sudden rush of heat flooded my chest, my pulse kicking up as I stormed back toward the house. My mother was in the kitchen, humming softly as she chopped vegetables for dinner. The scent of garlic and onions filled the air, comforting, familiar. But right now, it did nothing to calm the anger simmering inside me. "Mom," I said, my voice tight, "you're not going to believe this." She glanced up, took one look at my face, and sighed. "The HOA again?" I slapped the notice onto the counter. "They're threatening to have me arrested over a freaking mailbox." Mom wiped her hands on a dish towel before picking up the paper, her expression shifting from mild exasperation to outright disbelief. "Arrested?" She read it again, her brows furrowing. "This has to be a mistake. They can't actually—" "They think they can," I cut in. "They gave me 48 hours to change it or else." She exhaled through her nose, her grip on the notice tightening. "This is beyond ridiculous. Your father needs to see this." I rolled my eyes. "Yeah, well, he's the mayor, not the HOA king. What's he gonna do? Issue an executive order for them to leave me alone?" Her lips twitched, but she didn't smile. "You know he won't let them get away with this." Maybe. But I wasn't the kind of person to sit around and wait for someone else to fix my problems. I needed to handle this myself. My mind raced as I pushed away from the counter and grabbed my phone. There was no way I was letting some power-hungry HOA board tell me what I could and couldn't do with my property. I typed out a quick message to my best friend, Liv. "You're not going to believe what the HOA is pulling now." "What now?" "Did you accidentally break their sacred grass-cutting rule?" "Worse, they're threatening to have me arrested over my mailbox." "What?" "Yeah. Apparently, it's an unapproved design. That's insane. You know what you have to do, right?" "Oh, I have ideas." My thumb hovered over the screen, the gears in my head turning. I knew exactly what I needed to do. I needed to confront them. The next morning, I barely waited for the sun to fully rise before heading straight to the HOA office. I wasn't going to let them get away with this. The building itself was as bland and oppressive as the organization running it. Beige walls, beige floors, even the chairs in the tiny waiting area were beige, like color was considered a violation of the sacred HOA handbook. Behind the desk sat her, Mrs. Vance, the woman who had somehow appointed herself as the neighborhood overlord. She was in her 60s with tightly curled gray hair and a pair of thick-rimmed glasses that made her already sharp gaze even more piercing. She was dressed in her usual blazer, the kind that made her look more like a lawyer than the president of a neighborhood committee. She barely glanced up when I approached. "Can I help you?" I dropped the notice onto her desk. "Yeah, you can explain why you're threatening to have me arrested over a mailbox." Her expression didn't flicker. If anything, she seemed bored. "Oh, another compliance issue. Another?" I repeated, incredulous. "This isn't just a fine, Mrs. Vance. You're talking about legal action over something completely ridiculous." She adjusted her glasses, eyes scanning the paper like she hadn't personally signed it. "We take violations very seriously in this neighborhood." I scoffed. "Seriously enough to have someone arrested?" She gave a slow, practiced smile. "Rules are rules, Miss Daniels." Something in my chest tightened. My last name meant something here. I could hear it in the way she said it. Daniels. My father's name. She didn't realize who I was, not yet, but she knew my family. And if she thought she could intimidate me into backing down, she was so wrong. I straightened, meeting her gaze head on. We'll see about that. And with that, I turned on my heel and walked out. They thought they could scare me into submission. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I barely made it out of the HOA office before my hands started shaking. Not from fear, no, that would have made too much sense. This was something else entirely, a slow-burning rage curling through my veins like smoke before a fire. Mrs. Vance had looked me in the eye and told me, in no uncertain terms, that I could be arrested if I didn't bow to their ridiculous rules, like she was doing me a favor by even pretending to explain herself. Like I was just another name on her list of neighborhood offenders. She had no idea who I was. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My phone buzzed in my lap, and I glanced down to see a text from Liv. So, how'd it go? They doubled down, said rules are rules. Okay, but they can't actually arrest you, right? That's what I need to find out, because at this point, I didn't trust them. Not after the way Mrs. Vance had looked at me, like I was nothing more than an inconvenience, something to be dealt with. She hadn't been bluffing. She had enjoyed saying it. And that was what unsettled me the most. I pulled out of the parking lot, barely registering the houses blurring past as I drove. Everything in Westwood Heights was perfectly uniform, as if someone had designed the entire neighborhood on a computer and then copy-pasted each house like an architect's lazy shortcut. White fences, neutral-colored exteriors, neatly trimmed hedges, no individuality, no character, just like the HOA wanted. By the time I pulled into my driveway, my mom was waiting on the porch, arms crossed, watching me with that particular look, concern laced with something else, something sharper. Well, she asked as soon as I stepped out of the car. I slammed the door shut. They're not backing down. She inhaled slowly, then let it out in a measured breath. Your father will want to hear about this. I rubbed my temples. I can handle it. She gave me a knowing look. If you could handle it, you wouldn't be clenching your fists like you're ready for a fight. I forced myself to relax my hands. My dad had dealt with more than his fair share of ridiculous bureaucratic power trips over the years. Maybe he could do something. Maybe he had some kind of leverage. But even as the thought crossed my mind, I hated it. The idea of running to my dad for help, like I couldn't fight my own battles. Still, as much as I hated to admit it, this wasn't just about a mailbox anymore. This was about power. That night, we sat around the dinner table, my father listening in silence as I told him everything. He didn't interrupt, didn't ask questions, just sat there, his expression unreadable, until I finished. Then, finally, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands in front of him. So let me get this straight, he said slowly. The HOA is threatening to have you arrested over a mailbox. Yes, his lips twitched, but it wasn't amusement. It was something else, something sharper. That's interesting. I frowned. Interesting? I've seen power-hungry HOAs before, but this is new. I don't think they have the authority to enforce something like this. He tilted his head. Did they mention how they planned to go about it? I hesitated. Just that legal action would be taken if I didn't comply. He hummed thoughtfully, then stood, grabbing his phone from the counter. Give me a second. I exchanged a look with my mom, who only sighed and shook her head. We both knew that tone. It was the same one he used when a council member tried to push some underhanded policy through the system, or when he caught wind of corruption in local government. A minute later, he was on the phone, his voice calm but firm. Hey, Bill, quick question. Does the HOA in Westwood Heights have the authority to issue legal threats over minor infractions? A pause. Uh-huh. And what about threats of arrest? Silence. Then my father's lips curled into something dangerously close to a smirk. Interesting, he said again. Another pause. Well, that's good to know. Appreciate it. He hung up and turned back to me. They can't do a damn thing. Relief and anger hit me at the same time. Then why the hell are they pretending they can? My dad sat back down, steepling his fingers. Because people like Mrs. Vance thrive on fear. They throw around legal jargon, banking on the fact that most people won't question them. It's a power trip. I clenched my jaw. So what do I do? A slow smile spread across his face. You fight back. I exhaled sharply. And how do I do that? It's not like I can just. He raised a brow. What do we know about Mrs. Vance? I blinked. I what? What do we know about her? He repeated, eyes glinting with something almost mischievous. I stared at him for a second before realization clicked into place. If the HOA wanted to come after me over some bogus violation, then maybe it was time to find out whether they were following their own rules. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, all I could see was that smug look on Mrs. Vance's face, the way she'd so casually dismissed me like I was nothing more than an inconvenience, like I wasn't worth her time. The anger that had been simmering beneath my skin all day finally boiled over. I wasn't going to let this go. If the HOA wanted to play games, then fine, let's play. I kicked off the covers, grabbed my phone, and opened my laptop. If my dad was right, if the HOA was banking on people blindly following their rules without question, then I needed to find out just how many of their own rules they had been breaking. Westwood Heights had a reputation. People whispered about how the HOA board members lived by a different set of standards, bending the rules to benefit themselves while cracking down on everyone else. But no one ever did anything about it. They were afraid. Afraid of fines, of consequences, of being targeted. I wasn't. I started with the public records database. It took me a few tries to navigate the system, but once I figured it out, it was like peeling back the layers of a well-kept secret. And what I found? It was gold. Mrs. Vance, queen of HOA enforcement, had been living in violation of multiple regulations for years. Her fence was too tall, by exactly 2 inches. Her landscaping extended onto a public sidewalk, a clear violation of neighborhood policies. And the best part? Her mailbox was unapproved. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen in disbelief before a slow, satisfied grin spread across my face. Hypocrisy at its finest. I had everything I needed. The next morning, I wasn't just angry, I was determined. I printed out the documents, tucked them into a folder, and headed straight for the kitchen, where my dad was sipping his morning coffee. He raised an eyebrow when he saw me. "You're up early," he said. "That's suspicious." I dropped the folder onto the counter. "You're gonna love this." He picked it up, flipped through the pages, and let out a low whistle. Well, well, well. He looked up, eyes twinkling with amusement. "She's been violating her own rules?" "For years," I confirmed. He let out a thoughtful hum. "And what's your plan?" I met his gaze. "I'm going to make sure she knows I know." His smile was slow and approving. "Now that," he said, "is the Daniels way." I was still running on adrenaline when I pulled into the HOA office parking lot. This time, I didn't hesitate. I marched straight inside, folder in hand, ready for war. Mrs. Vance was at her desk, looking as bored and disinterested as ever. Her gaze flicked up when she saw me, and she sighed, setting down her pen like I was the last person she wanted to deal with today. "Miss Daniels," she said flatly. "Again?" I smiled, all teeth. "Oh, don't worry. I won't take much of your time." I stepped forward and placed the folder on her desk. She eyed it like it might explode. "What's this?" she asked. I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice just enough to make her uncomfortable. "Just some interesting information I came across last night." She hesitated, then opened the folder. I watched her expression shift from mild annoyance to something that almost resembled fear. Her mouth tightened. "This?" She cleared her throat. "Where did you get these documents?" I tilted my head. "They're public record. You know, the same kind of record the HOA uses to police everyone else in this neighborhood." Her fingers clenched around the papers. "This is a misunderstanding." "Oh?" I crossed my arms. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been breaking the very rules you've been threatening to have me arrested for." She inhaled sharply. This is different." "Is it?" I raised an eyebrow. "Because I'm pretty sure the rules apply to everyone, Mrs. Vance, including you." For the first time, she looked rattled. I leaned in just a little closer. "So here's what's going to happen," I said, keeping my voice calm and even. "You're going to void my violation. You're going to leave me and my mailbox alone. And if you don't," I smiled sweetly, "then I'll make sure every single homeowner in Westwood Heights gets a copy of these records." Her face drained of color. "You wouldn't," she whispered. "Try me." The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. I could see the calculations running through her head, the way her fingers twitched slightly as she fought to regain control of the situation. But she had already lost. She knew it, and I knew it. Slowly, she reached for the stamp on her desk. Void. The ink pressed onto my violation notice. Stark and final. She didn't look at me as she shoved the paper back across the desk. There, she said stiffly. It's voided. I picked it up, inspecting it like I might challenge her. But I didn't need to. I had won. I tucked it into my bag, then straightened, flashing her one last smirk. Have a great day, Mrs. Vance. I turned on my heel and walked out, feeling her stare burning into my back. She had no idea how lucky she was that I wasn't in a worse mood. I wasn't done. Sure, Mrs. Vance had voided my violation, but that didn't erase the fact that she had tried to use fear to control me. How many others had she bullied into submission? How many people had paid fines they didn't actually owe? How many had been forced to alter their homes just to avoid bogus legal threats? This wasn't just about me anymore. I sat in my car outside the HOA office, gripping the steering wheel, my mind racing. There was something deeply satisfying about watching Mrs. Vance squirm under the weight of her own hypocrisy, but it wasn't enough. She would try again, on me or someone else. That was the thing about people like her. They didn't stop unless someone made them stop. I needed a plan. I pulled out my phone and called Liv. She picked up on the second ring. Tell me you got the justice you deserved, she said by way of greeting. Oh, I got more than that, I said, my voice light. But I'm not finished. I heard her grin through the phone. Tell me everything. I told her about the violations, about how Mrs. Vance had been breaking her own rules for years, and how she had caved the moment I called her out. By the time I was done, Liv was cackling. Okay, this is iconic, she said. But you're right, you can't just leave it at that. You need to make sure she can't do this to anyone else. Exactly. Silence stretched between us as we both considered the best way to hit where it hurt. Then, finally, Liv spoke. What if we expose her? I blinked. Like how? You said it yourself. This isn't just about you. People in this neighborhood have been scared of the HOA for years, right? What if we give them a reason to fight back? A slow smile spread across my face. Go on. We don't just tell people about her violations. We show them, Liv said, excitement creeping into her voice. Make it public. Social media, flyers, a full-blown neighborhood-wide scandal. I leaned back in my seat, thinking it over. It was bold, risky, but it was perfect. You're a genius, I said. I know. I ended the call and got to work. That night, Liv and I gathered every single violation we could find and compiled them into one beautifully damning document. We didn't just list the infractions, we highlighted them, adding screenshots of the HOA's own rulebook for comparison. By the time we were done, it was irrefutable. Then came phase 2. We printed hundreds of flyers. Some with side-by-side photos of her violations and the rulebook's regulations. Others with bold, attention-grabbing headlines. Is the HOA above their own rules? They find you, but look at what they've been hiding. We even made a dedicated website with links to public records, giving everyone in the neighborhood easy access to see for themselves. And then, just before sunrise, we distributed them. We hit every mailbox, every doorstep, every community bulletin board. By the time the first residents were waking up for their morning jogs, Westwood Heights had already erupted into whispers. And by noon, it was chaos. The HOA office was flooded with calls, people demanding explanations, demanding refunds for bogus fines, demanding to know how long they had been lied to. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down were now furious, their voices rising in unity against the people who had spent years keeping them in check. Mrs. Vance was trapped. She couldn't ignore this, not when half the neighborhood was outside her office demanding answers. And the best part? I wasn't even there. I was at home, sitting comfortably on my couch with a lemonade in hand, watching the entire thing unfold through a live stream someone had posted. The comments were brutal. The HOA scammed us. Vance needs to resign. Refund our money or we take legal action. I smirked, taking a slow sip of my drink. By the end of the day, the HOA board held an emergency meeting. By the end of the week, Mrs. Vance had stepped down. And by the end of the month, new policies were in place. No more arbitrary fines. No more bogus legal threats. No more HOA dictatorship. I had won. I never got an apology from Mrs. Vance. I never expected one. But I did get something even better: freedom. And my mailbox? It stayed exactly where it was.